and we conduct the business of the community in an effective and efficient manner as set forth in town code and state law. This means that we do not tolerate disruptive conduct, which includes but is not limited to addressing the council without first being recognized, interrupting speakers, council, or staff, continuing to speak after allotted time has expired, and failing to relinquish the microphone when directed to do so. And so with that, if I can call today's meeting to order and ask Ms. Neese to do roll call.
Thank you and good evening. Councilmember Risto.
Here.
Councilmember Hudis.
Here.
Councilmember Badami.
Here.
Vice Mayor Rennie.
Here.
Mayor and Chair Styock.
Here. And we are all here and we can begin. So just to give context for today's study session, as you see, there's only one item on our topic of agenda. So what I will do is I will share verbal communications that will be at the end of the meeting so that those that would like to be able to speak based on the conversation and staff report will have an opportunity to do so. Just a reminder, today's study session is in response to the agenda item request of council members at our October 19, 2021 council meeting session regarding SB 9 and an alternative base on the RHNA, the Regional Housing Allocation Number allocation of 1,993 units. We'll have an opportunity as a council to discuss with staff SB 9 and its implications and consequences at a later meeting. Today's study session really is an opportunity for the council to discuss housing growth options, including but not limited to the RHNA alternative, and identify additional information for Planning Commission's consideration. This was set as a study session so that we can ensure that no action on the general plan occurs. It's very important that we follow the process as dictated by state law, and so we cannot act on the draft general plan until environmental review is completed and until the town council receives a recommendation from its planning commission. So today, just to set expectations by those in attendance, there will be no motion or action by the collective council. Now, obviously, there are opportunities to have discussion and share preferences by individual council members, but please be aware that the public process is still ongoing. We'll likely receive and continue to receive more public comments. And as with every council meeting, we make final decisions after hearing all public comment. And so we ask all public members to continue to submit comments, stay engaged on the draft 2040 general plan, including any preferences you hear today and any related changes that you believe should occur. And this is one of many steps as we continue the process, not only with the environmental impact review, planning commission meetings, and then ultimately council meetings next year. And so with that, I look to staff to guide us in today's study session. Thank you.
Good evening, Mayor, council members. And I have prepared a PowerPoint presentation just to touch on a few points. Thank you very much, Aaron. So this evening's study session, as the mayor just stated, is in response to questions posed at the October 19th, 2021 council meeting, which provide an opportunity for the council to discuss housing growth options and identify additional information for the Planning Commission's consideration. Next slide, please. So when we look at the request for this meeting, there were 2 points that were brought up. One is discussing SB 9, that's Senate Bill 9. It's a state law that was signed by the governor in September and goes into effect at the beginning of 2022. Additional information about this state law will be provided for consideration by town council. We've got that tentatively scheduled for the 21st of this month. We also expect additional guidance from the State Department of Housing and Community Development, HCD, in February of 2022. And until we get that guidance, it really is premature for our town staff or the consultant to speculate or advise on what effects SB 9 may have on the draft 2040 general plan. So the content and discussion tonight really is likely to focus more on the second point here. And
recording in progress.
And so the second point requested really leads us to a discussion of what information about housing growth options should be provided to Planning Commission when we bring the draft general plan, the 2040 draft general plan, to Planning Commission early in the new year for their consideration. Next slide, please. So in the written staff report, we provided some additional information about some of the housing growth options that could be considered. We have the recommended draft general plan. That's the recommendation from the general plan advisory committee, update advisory committee. And this is their recommendation based on 2.5 years of work going through the process to look at the existing general plan and make a recommendation based on that review. The draft 2040 general plan is a recommendation for a 20-year time frame, so 20 years of growth. And it was conducted, the update and review process was conducted with an understanding that the next housing element, an 8-year housing element, would likely have to provide room for 2,000 additional housing units. The affordability levels we'll get more into detail of those as part of the housing element update. And the staff report provides some additional alternatives, taking this direction from council members. So ways that this draft general plan might be modified. So in response to public comments that we've received, you could recommend that we provide information to Planning Commission about how the numbers might be presented if we maintained the low density and medium density residential land use designations with the same density limitations that are currently in place under the 2020 general plan. Another alternative would be to remove the housing densities from the office, professional, and service commercial designations. That was a recommendation from the GPAC after initial feedback from council in November of 2020. There are other options as well. Other changes in residential densities based on zoning or based on land use designation, or say, for example, removal of the community commercial designation and just maintaining the neighborhood commercial designation. Any of these types of options can be presented to Planning Commission and then to Town Council for consideration. Next slide. So that brings me to the next steps in this process. This process is not over. We have a recommended draft general plan from the GPAC, but that still has review through the environmental impact report process. So we will be tomorrow going to Planning Commission and providing an opportunity for verbal comments on the revised draft EIR. And that comments on the revised draft EIR are actually accepted in written form through Friday, January 7th of 2020. Once we have closed that reopened public comment period, we will work with the consultants to prepare a final EIR, which will include response to all comments received on the draft EIR, both during the initial comment period and this reopened period. And then we will take all of that information and all public comments that have been received on the draft EIR to the Planning Commission for their review and recommendation to Town Council. And they will have an opportunity at that point to make recommendations for changes based on public comment or other discussions during that meeting. And then Town Council will consider the draft 2040 general plan along with the recommendation from GPAC and a recommendation from Planning Commission, as well as additional changes recommended by the community. The plan and schedule provided by the consultant actually includes 2 meetings by town council, an initial review of these recommendations, and then based on the comments from town council, they will then make revisions and provide a final 2040 general plan, and that will be considered with the final EIR for a decision. We are hoping to be able to bring that to town council in April. Next slide, please. So as I said, we have more choices. This is not a done deal. There are still opportunities to provide comments. I continue to join the community at the farmers market once every 3 or 4 weeks and plan to continue to do so until we do bring this to Planning Commission for their review. We are going out and talking with community organizations. We had a community meeting, online community meeting in October where we received additional comments and discussion. And we are now starting our housing element update. And the next Housing Element Advisory Board meeting is going to be December 16th. So here in the presentation, I wanted to make sure that we listed where all of these documents are available online at losgatos2040.com and where written comments can be submitted. Anything that's submitted through the GP2040 at losgatosca.gov email address does come through staff and will be presented and shared with Planning Commission at their meeting. So this concludes staff's presentation, but we are here and available and happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Ms. Armour. Okay, so Vice Mayor Rennie.
Thank you, Mayor. Let me start with a question. In our report on page 7, there's a table. I want to understand better. There's 2 columns, one for what we call the residential capacity for the 2040 general plan, and then the potential eligible units for the housing element. I wanted to understand why there's a difference. Why do we have units included in the general plan that can't be used for housing element?
Thank you, Council Member. The reason that we put together this table was to try and show the fact that when we look at the build-out table that's in the draft 2040 draft general plan, there are numbers there that include more than what will be included when we are working on our RENA allocation for the housing element update. So for example, there are a couple of easy categories that we would remove from that. So there in the build out, we include projects that are already approved, including some that are likely to receive building permits before the housing element is adopted and certified, and therefore would not count towards the RENA allocation for this next 8-year cycle. There are other elements, housing units, including a good portion of the accessory dwelling units that are forecast. We have a set number of accessory dwelling units that we are predicting would be approved annually. And since this is a 20-year plan, only 8 years worth of those would be included. And so in order to try and provide some numbers that are more comparable to the RENA, while we aren't able to do the full analysis that would be part of the housing element update, we're able to remove those 2 components to try and bring this number make it more comparable to the RENA number.
So let me follow up on that question to make sure it's a little clearer. So in it, you mentioned 300 ADUs that are outside the 8-year cycle. So you're referring to your forecast of 300 units would be built after this the 6th cycle. You're forecasting before 2040 there would be 300 more units, but they won't be built before the end of this 6th 8-year cycle. Is that what you're saying?
Correct. We're forecasting 25 accessory dwelling units be built each year, and so over 8-year cycle, that would be 200 of the 500 used in the full general plan.
And then the other 400 existing units, you're assuming a general plan would kind of be approved soon, but the housing element wouldn't be approved till the end of the year. So the difference is everything that's this year. Actually, maybe it's everything in 21 and 22 would count in the general plan, but not in the housing element. Is that how we're kind of getting there?
It's similar to that, yes. The 475, that of course was a point in time based on the projects that were pending or approved when the draft was prepared, and our best estimate of that. And so in looking at that number, it is very likely that 400 of the 475 could be expected to have building permits issued before then. A portion of those are North 40 projects, and so based on the status of that, but then other projects as well.
Mayor, if I could go to a second question, different sort of same question. So as part of our RENA number, we're supposed to plan for different income affordability levels, and those are, I assume they have to be income restricted. So for example, someone might build an ADU that is, maybe it's affordable, but if it's not income restricted, can we count it towards our affordability goals in our RENA number? In other words, do all of those, there's some rules in there that if, you know, a site, if we don't meet them, we have to go plan for some more and things like that. And so I'm trying to understand if we happen to have some housing that's built affordably or comes up to an affordable number, but if it's not income restricted, can we count it towards our affordable, with ADUs being an example of that?
Thank you, Vice Mayor. We do have an ability to count some of these types of units if we have the data to show that they are more affordable and what category they'd be in. But that kind of analysis is the kind of thing that is part of the housing element update. I'm also going to pass this question on to Mr. Paulson, Community Development Director.
Thank you, Vice Mayor. So as Ms. Armour mentioned, in our current cycle, we actually are allowed to count all of our ADUs as moderate income, even though they are not deed restricted. We will be going through a similar effort to see what categories we can apply ADUs to in the next cycle. So that will be another effort that we'll be taking on with the housing.
Okay, thank you. I have another question, but I'm going to let others ask questions first. I'll yield the floor. Thank you.
Thank you. Councilmember Gatos.
Thank you. One simple question is, Ms. Armour, you mentioned that the Housing Element Advisory Board is meeting on December 16th. What general plan are they developing that housing element for? In other words, we don't have an approved 2040 general plan. So how are they able to develop a housing element without a general plan?
Thank you for that question. The analysis can start with the 2020 general plan and look at potential housing sites and potential programs, and some ideas that might be considered could come from the draft 2040 general plan. But they are looking at how they would set up a map to start looking at potential sites, and that discussion can start with the 2020 general plan, since that is the general plan that's in effect.
Okay, I'll be interested to follow that, because I'm not sure if you're going to do, as the 2040 draft proposes, an upzoning across the town from 0 to 5 for single family dwellings to 1 to 12. How you go about even thinking about what numbers you're going to get in single family residences. So it'll be interesting to see how that actually works. It looks to me like the cart before the horse. I had another question, which is somewhat related, and that relates to SB 9. I understand that guidance is going to come from HCD potentially in February. And in the staff report, it sounds like the guidance will come after the adoption potentially, or certainly a vote on the general plan. And again, in the spirit of sort of cart before the horse, it seems as though other municipalities have at least tried to work with what impact there might be of SB 9, trying to come up with the best information that we have at the time. And I think the HCD guidance may prove helpful at some point, but I think, you know, the term premature was used. I think that it could be premature to enact a general plan when it doesn't analyze the impact of a law that's already in effect on January 1st, 2022. So that was why that was in the motion. And I would try to, not the motion, but the agenda item. And that's why I think it's important that we come to that. I understand we may not be prepared tonight, but I really think we need to use our best information about the impact of SB 9 before we vote a general plan.
I would just offer Councilmember Hudis. Uh-oh, I think the mayor might be rubbing off on me. Ultimately, we're not anticipating a vote on the general plan before we get that guidance. I think Ms. Armour mentioned that it's probably likely potentially in April when it will get to the town council. By then we will have hopefully that guidance. That guidance will also feed into the housing element update process. And so that might be another program that we are able to utilize for our housing element. There's a lot of background work that needs to be done, a lot of conversations around site selection. And then once those sites are selected, you know, whether it's the existing general plan numbers or we get to the point where we have an adopted general plan, those numbers can be changed and we can reanalyze that. Ultimately, we will need a general plan in place prior to getting a public draft out of a housing element. If we don't have that, then we will be woefully short as far as numbers, even for this first cycle. And then ultimately, we are also under some pretty tight time constraints on the housing element side. So if we don't, for instance, have a general plan in place and we need to get a housing element to HCD, then we may have to include additional programs and or zoning updates of sites in our housing element implementation program. But we're hopeful that we're going to continue through the housing element process, continue through the general plan process, receive feedback on the general plan. And then once we get to that point, if we're at a point where we need to pause on the housing element for making that final from a public draft perspective, we may need to do that. But that's going to be an evolution that we're going to have to analyze early next year.
If I may, just one really quick question related, and that is, what happens if HCD doesn't approve what we send in? Do we immediately go into a mode where infrastructure dollars are being withheld and the state takes over our process? Or is there a period where we can remedy what we do send in?
So there is a remedy period, but there's also new state law that requires some additional public review time as well as HCD review time. So we anticipate that, you know, we'll get the public draft out for, I believe, 30 days. We'll collect those comments from the public on the public draft before it's even gone to HCD. We'll have 10 days to respond to those. Then we'll get to a planning commission, town council conversation before shipping that off to HCD. And then they will do their review, send back their comments, and then we will go through that path as many times as we need, hopefully prior to the typical deadline, which is January 31st, 2023. There is some time in there from a remedy perspective, should it be needed. And we're watching carefully the other jurisdictions that are on a slightly different path to see how that is handled for specifically, the Southern California region as well as the Sacramento region.
Thank you.
Councilmember Badami.
Thank you. I need to understand staff's assumption on numbers that was previously provided to us, and we have it tonight in attachment 1, attachment A. So I have a series of questions related to this document. So if I may, Mayor, I've got probably about 4 or 5. So where did the assumption of 2,929 housing units come from? What basis do we have for that assumption?
Thank you, council member. So I believe we're looking at a table that shows the housing numbers. Let's see, we actually have a version of this, Arn, if you'd like to show that. It is, let's see, page 11 of the PDF that I provided you. I believe. No, except that I'm not seeing the 2,000 that you're talking about, or the 1,900. I guess these numbers are slightly different from what was included in the attachment A to attachment 1.
Since that was part of the staff report, Arn, is that possible to pull up?
Yeah, that would be page 16. Sorry about that.
Thank you. Thank
Because
you.
even if the numbers are close, I just need to know, where did the assumption come from? What is it based on?
So that number of housing units is a calculation of new housing units that would be through redevelopment of existing developed parcels. And so it was based on an assumption for what the general typical density would be, combined with a redevelopment assumption of what percentage of the properties would redevelop. And that brings you to that number. This attachment does call out one error, typo that was included in the new housing for vacant land. We typed in 166 instead of 116 for the hillside residential. So that was a correction for that there.
Okay, so if this is an assumption, it could be wrong. It could even be higher than that. Am I correct?
So this is an assumption this is a calculation that was provided by our consultants and was developed based on growth projections as well as the changes in the densities, and was done in consultation with their economic development sub-consultant.
Okay, so as I look at this chart, that allows for the approval up to 15,538 units. Am I correct with that? With a population increase of 37,292, which is pretty much our existing town population. Is that how I read that?
So it appears that the commenter provided a revised version of some of these calculations, assuming that every existing parcel in town would be redeveloped.
Okay, so with that information also included in our attachment number 1, we actually have a letter from the Los Gatos Community Alliance, and they're purporting potential for development of up to 74,007 units. Can staff elaborate on that? Do we have the potential for a maximum build out of 74,007 units?
So I do believe, again, that is based on the assumption that every parcel would be redeveloped at the maximum possible development. And based on standard review of this type of document, we do not assume 100% redevelopment. That this is the recommendation and assumptions from the consultant. I believe that the Community Development Director, Joel Paulson, may have something else to add.
I'll just add, that the numbers that are provided in both of those, again, as Ms. Armour mentioned, assume we're starting from scratch with bare land, with nothing, and that everything gets developed at the maximum density.
Okay.
Frankly, from my perspective, that's not realistic, but that is what those numbers show.
Okay, so last question. We have a draft EIR that supposedly provides full disclosure of analysis and impacts the whole of the project. So is the sum build out of 74,007 units addressed as a potential for the whole of a project that could be done?
The standard analysis for a plan, right, rather than a proposed development, it is what's included in the draft EIR. And we did receive this letter, as you mentioned, as a comment on the draft EIR. And so further explanation and response to those comments will be part of the final EIR and response to comments. If Joel Paulson has anything more to add? No. Okay.
Councilmember Badami, do you have more questions?
I'll hold off for now. I have more, but I'll concede to someone else.
Okay, Councilmember Risto.
Thank you, Mayor. I want to thank the staff, first of all, for presenting, putting together these options that I know you did that in advance of what you'd have to present to the Planning Commission. But having sat on the GPAC for the last year, the first term in office, along with Councilmember Badami and the whole GPAC committee, it was interesting to watch how the process unfolded. Going in, knowing that we had a huge amount of housing to prepare for based on the fact that pretty much none of the cities in Silicon Valley have built to keep up with where we need to be. We finally all got these huge numbers, and we had to suddenly think about a very different way to build, as opposed to, oh, there's a vacant lot here and a vacant lot there. How do we redevelop within a mostly built out town? And I realized that, there is perhaps for some people, it's hard to think 20 years out, or it's hard to consider a number as high as maybe 3,900 housing units. And I don't know if necessarily that's the right number, but it certainly wasn't a goal. There wasn't a specific number that the GPAC was working toward. It was more of a process of, here's a location that makes sense to add density. Here's a location where we could build more housing. And as we worked through the process and worked on quite a few other elements in addition, this is where we came out. So I think it's actually quite helpful to have these different options to discuss, so that as we move through the process and the Planning Commission considers these options and the public weighs in, there is kind of a lot of choices to either retain or scale back. And I kind of liken it to when I have to do some writing, it's a lot easier to write way too much and then edit and scale back. We've got this large building envelope where we could meet our RHNA numbers and we could potentially meet our obligations for the next 20 years. But if it's the will of the community, or if it's the will of the Planning Commission, we could meet our RHNA numbers and we could potentially meet our obligations for the next 20 years. But if it's the will of the community, or if it's the will of the Planning Commission to scale back somewhat, it's a lot easier now because the draft EIR considers the higher number of housing. And so if we do go down, we're covered. And, I think the town attorney had made that point, which was very useful. So I'm really happy with the fact that we'll be able to have these discussions and make some decisions as a community of how we want to address our needs and obligations. The questions I've got are, first of all, we're in a RHNA cycle right now with 619 housing units. If we don't meet that, and I don't think we will, do those numbers roll over into our next RHNA number, or is the sixth cycle RHNA number basically stand on its own, and if we don't meet the full 619, we still have that number? That's my first question.
So they do not, thank you, council member, they do not roll over. The 1993 is the sixth cycle number. And so we would move forward with that number.
Okay, and then, as we're going through this, of the 475 that we're talking about potentially being completed before we start the next cycle, does that include housing units to fulfill our 619 fifth cycle, Rena?
Thank you, council members. It does, however, depending on the affordability level, because that 600 number is including housing at different affordability levels, these units may not fulfill the individual categories that are required from the fifth cycle.
Okay, thank you. Are they in categories where we had made plans? I mean, I realize we don't build the housing, we make plans for it. In the last cycle, we were told 20 units per acre is planning for affordability. I don't know if these other units being built are being built in the sites or in the areas where we had allocated in the last cycle.
So it's a mix. Thank you, council member. We will probably exceed our above market rate unit number. We may hit our moderate unit number, but the very low, or the low and the very low, we will probably not hit those numbers. So, one instance, as you mentioned, with the default density, where the state housing and community development says if you're 20 units per acre, you're affordable. So when we went through the last housing element planning cycle, for instance, if there was a property that could build at 20 units per acre, the town was permitted to use that site as all affordable units. And so that is typically the case. We'll revisit that conversation for sure in this housing element cycle. And that's where some of these conversations of buffer and no net loss come up because those regulations are more stringent than they were before. So we're going to be looking at those as we move forward with the housing element.
Okay, great. And then one final question, which is just a small one. I know when you were talking about the ADUs were counted at moderate, and we'll have to see where they are. Does that include junior ADUs, or do you think those will count differently? And when you talk about projected 25 ADUs a year, is that just a mix of ADUs, junior ADUs? They're all just one category?
Thank you. Those are currently in one category because that came after the last cycle was adopted. A lot of these new ADU laws came forward, and so up until probably 2017, maybe even 2018, we had very few ADUs because our regulations didn't permit them very often. That has changed, and so that's why we're seeing an increase, and that's why I'm hoping to utilize that. We will do that analysis again at part of the housing element and look at some differentiating factors between ADUs and JADUs to see if there is an opportunity to potentially count them in a different category.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. And then I would just say that, with the options that we have here, I think it will be important for the Planning Commission to look at, the GPAC had a lot of discussion about missing middle housing, but that was before SB 9. And it could be, and it can be called out, as you've done, an option to potentially, instead of trying to do missing middle housing, to just assume that SB 9 and ADUs will take care of that, will provide more affordable options within residential neighborhoods. But we'll have to see how that unfolds. But anyway, I appreciate all of the options you put out there. Thank you.
You. And before I go to another round of questions from council members, I do have a quick question to staff. Can you just clarify how the environmental process works with the projections that we have in front of us? Right now, what's being circulated has a projection of 3,900. And so using the attachment 1 full capacity of 75,000 housing units. If our EIR doesn't look at that maximum build out, when do we hit a threshold where we would have to do another environmental impact report?
Thank you, Mayor. I don't want to dive too far in, as this is a comment that was received on the draft EIR, which will have to be responded to.
Sure.
But ultimately, let's use the assumptions that are in the draft EIR. And for instance, by year 7, we are getting close to that or exceeding that. And just so folks know, obviously we monitor that every year. We have to do an annual progress report to State Housing and Community Development. So we have a pretty good idea. And that not only is building permit issued, which is the only thing we get credit for, but planning application submitted, planning approval, then building permit issued, and certificate of use and occupancy. So there's a number of levels that we look at that. So if we came up to that threshold, we'd have to analyze and make a determination, do we need to go back into the general plan and do some further analysis, which may include additional environmental analysis. We are looking at options to have a tighter review of the land use element because this is such an important topic. And so probably making a recommendation to Planning Commission that every 5 years at a minimum, we look at the land use element to make sure that we are still within those thresholds and whether or not any changes need to be made. But again, we do look at that yearly. So we would have a pretty good pulse if it's before the 5 years and we're running into this number or we're getting close or we're halfway there. We're going to be bringing that back to council so that we can have that conversation and get some direction.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate it. So then, correct me then, what I'm hearing is there are triggers built into our process that if we have planning that goes out of the parameters that we're studying right now, there are triggers that allow us to re-examine those different mechanisms.
That's correct.
Okay, thank you for that clarification. Councilmember Badami?
Thank you. I'd like to go back to that chart again, attachment 1, attachment A. And I want to make sure that I'm correct in reading the 1,013 housing unit number for the existing general plan, that would require us to only find capacity for about 1,000 more units. Is that correct? And I'll have one more question after that.
Which number, if you could, Councilmember, clarify which number you're looking at?
The 1,013, it's in the white column in the middle.
The new units, new and redeveloped combined.
Yes,
that in number. The existing general plan. So that is an estimate based on the existing general plan density regulations.
Okay, so if this is true, then maybe we could find capacity for just 1,000 more units and meet our numbers. And that being said, can we meet those numbers with high density residential zoning rather than upzoning across the whole town?
So there, as described in the staff report, there are definitely other options for how we might modify the draft 2040 general plan for consideration of housing options. Right now, if you look at the comparable number in the blue column there, instead of 1,013, under the draft general plan, it's 2,923 or 29. And so that could be reduced as discussed in the staff report by modifying the densities in different designations to whether that's modification of low density housing designations or in others.
Okay, thank you.
And Councilmember Badami, did you have another question?
No, that's it for now. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Councilmember Hudis.
Thank you. I wanted to ask about the comments.
Excuse me, Mr. Hudis, before you continue, you're low and KCAT is having a hard time hearing you.
Okay, let me get closer to the mic.
Thank you.
So I wanted to ask a little bit about the public comment process that we've had so far. I understand tonight we're going to take comments after we're finished. Is that correct?
Correct. So that the members of the public who want to listen to our discussion may have an opportunity to do so.
Okay, great. And but there have been public comments that have come in previous study sessions on the website, and there have also been comments to the EIR. I'm curious why we haven't seen those. They weren't provided for this meeting.
Thank you, Councilmember Hudis. The public comments that have been received since the final meeting of the General Plan Update Advisory Committee in May, between that and your study session in September, were provided with that staff report. So there was all of the public comments that had been received to that point were included there, with the exclusion of the EIR, the comments that were specifically on the environmental impact report. The comments that are received on the environmental impact report will be included in the final EIR. And so those will include a comment by comment response from the environmental consultant. And so those will be included in what you receive, what Planning Commission receives, and then what Town Council receives before final consideration. And then the third category of comments is anything that's been received since that September meeting. Because today's meeting was a very focused discussion, we provided the public comments that were specifically made for tonight's meeting. The other comments, because they are for consideration and deliberations of the general plan, will be provided to Planning Commission when they review that document. And we are compiling that and expect to have a summary of the topics included in the public comment received as part of the staff report as well, to try and help guide that discussion and provide some directions that Planning Commission could consider recommending in their discussion.
So if I could follow up on the EIR comments, is there a reason why we can't see those until they've been responded to? Is that a legal requirement that we can't see those comments as they've been coming in over the last, I don't know, 4 or 5 months?
The public comments on the EIR were those that were received during the initial 45-day public comment period. There were 13 comments received, plus an additional verbal comment was given to Planning Commission and will be included. There have been no additional comments on the environmental impact report received, either since then or since the beginning of the reopened comment period on November 19th.
But is there a reason that we can't see those until they're all responded to next year?
I believe it was just standard procedure that those comments, because they are on the EIR, and the EIR is not being considered yet because it isn't considered by Planning Commission or Town Council until we have the opportunity to respond to those comments, that all gets provided as part of the final EIR, but it may be Community Development Director has something to add.
No, I don't have anything to add. We typically keep that process separate. We can definitely speak with the town attorney to see if there may be an option to do that somehow separately and get that to council and then to the public prior to completing that review. But that is not something that is typically done.
Well, okay. But I think that there were a lot of comments at the joint study session and at the subsequent council meeting that are directly relevant to the preference that folks have suggested for basing our analysis on the RENA allocation of 1993. And those comments are just not in the record. And I've had a number of residents ask me why why those comments are not apparent for this session. I did have a more substantive question, and that relates to the chart that the vice mayor was referring to in his opening. And so in looking at the 20-year residential capacity, if it were adopted and zoning changes were made, what would prevent those from being bunched up in, let's say, the first 5 years of the 20-year plan, especially if they don't have to go through planning commission or public process, because some of them would fall under SB 9. And given SB 9, is it fair to assume that linear build of ADUs couldn't, for example, a rezoning of the North 40 Phase 2 result in much of the capacity being built out in a few years, perhaps before water, public transit, and traffic capacity can catch up, or if Los Gatos Lodge moved forward? So what would prevent things from sort of bunching up in 5 years?
Thank you, Councilmember. As the director mentioned before, we do have the annual reporting that we present to the state of housing units. So there is monitoring that is ongoing. But also I will add that the redevelopment assumptions that were included in the general plan were based on a 20-year timeline. So if we were looking at a shorter timeline, the percentage of redevelopment assumed would not actually have been as high, and we would have had lower numbers. But as I mentioned, and as the director mentioned, there is annual reporting, and so if the development did occur at a different rate than is projected, there is the opportunity for us to go back and take a look at those assumptions in the general plan and see if it is there is need to reconsider those. It does not require us to go the full 20 years before updating. In fact, the general plan does include a detailed review of the general plan after 10 years.
Okay, thank you.
Vice Mayor?
Thank you, Mayor. So we had talked a little bit earlier about the sequencing of the general plan and the draft housing element. Originally, our plan was to try to have the housing element passed by council and then do the housing element. And then I guess we'd have to pass the general plan with that added to it. Now they're starting to move a little more in parallel. So what I was thinking about, we want to provide, I think we want to provide the housing element team and then the planning commission review after that with multiple options so that they can figure out the best solution for our housing elements. And that could probably look like a large number in the general plan, maybe like it does now. But once they had made their choices to fit the housing elements, it would seem like we may want to then modify the housing element to remove things that they didn't use. Sorry, modify that general plan to remove things that the housing element didn't use, so that the number of additional units looks smaller. Hopefully I described that carefully. Is there some way we can do a process like that where when the housing element is finished, we can go back and kind of button up our general plan to get a number, a total housing number closer to what we think we want it to be?
Thank you, Vice Mayor. It is true that the alignment of these two different processes, there's more overlap than we originally planned for and expected. The plan originally was to have the draft general plan go through its process and its update, and have a land use element that provided the space so that once we started the housing element, there would be room within the 20-year land use element to have the housing units and the different affordability levels that are going to need to be part of the housing element update itself. At this point, they are overlapping, but the great work that the General Plan Update Advisory Committee did to go through these elements and make recommendations and provide ideas for programs still can be used and discussed by the Housing Element Advisory Board and included in those deliberations and their recommendations. So we will, keep both of these moving forward as much as we can. And as we get closer to decisions on one or the other, I'm sure there will be a discussion of the status of the others. And then if Director Paulson has something to add.
I will just add something, and then if Ms. Pravetti has something additional. I think, there's been a lot of conversation. There's all kinds of options. These are only a few of them. There may be an instance where we get to the Planning Commission, they recommend a lower number. Town Council may agree with them or recommend an even lower number. Then that will be utilized for the housing element. At that point, we would have an adopted general plan, finish up our housing element work. And if there's any gap between what was adopted in the general plan and what we need for the housing element, then we would have to add implementation programs for zone changes potentially, which have to happen within the first year after adoption of the housing element to make that gap up and then reevaluate moving forward. And then Ms. Pravetti, if you have anything additional.
Just to add that in that process, the council also has the ability to amend even a brand new general plan. So if there are changes that result from the housing element update that then require us to go back to the 2040 plan and make additional changes, the town council can certainly do that. And it would be best if we could package all of that together. So that way the council can see how alignment of the documents can occur.
So let me put a nickel through what I think I heard. Let's say we pass a general plan in April timeframe-ish, and we decide numbers too high, we're going to remove some of the additional density, for example, or we decide we want to remove the Downing Center from our list of opportunity zones. Would the housing element team still be able to know that those were options once considered and recommend to the council putting back the Downing Center, for example, and not using something else because they think that's a much better housing element site?
Thank you.
So I'll go ahead and jump in.
Okay.
And so, yes, that is a possibility. It would require a general plan amendment, probably, and which is what Ms. Pravetti was mentioning. You may have a general plan, some instance might pop up, and I think Councilmember Hudis mentioned, potential for what if additional units on the North 40 are done. Those are going to require future general plan amendments. We get the 2040 general plan in place, go through the housing element, wrap up the housing element process, and then see if any modifications are necessary to the general plan for the housing element. So that process is definitely possible.
So really what I'm getting at is if we put in a bunch of limits when we finally pass our general plan, those limits can be changed by the housing, asked to be changed by the housing element recommendation. And as part of the process, you will tell them, hey, we were thinking about, they probably already know that, but they will be able, it won't be out of their bounds to consider some of the things we may take off the table by the time we pass the general plan.
That's correct. And you have a lot of the same members in the HEB that were in the GPAC. The Housing Element Advisory Board is based on the General Plan Committee, and that is the same as the General Plan Update Advisory Committee was also based on that. So you have a core of residents who are working on both documents, have that past experience, and will continue to support this process moving forward.
Okay, thank you. That's it.
And if I could, I'm going to interject myself here before I go to Councilmember Bristow and Hudis. I want to take the flip side of that question. Having served on the first housing element, I know one of the things that we always state is that we don't build, we just plan. And so at what point do we, my understanding is that the general plan looked at many sites because ultimately it gives the developers the option to figure out what is best suitable for them to actually build on. If we start to narrow it so much, and then the sites we choose aren't necessarily the ones that developers feel are attractive, when does HCD come back and tell us these are no-go sites? Like, is that process that you mentioned at the end of the year, next year, where there's that back and forth?
Thank you, Mayor. The analysis of different sites and density in the land use element of the general plan is broader in that it is looking at what's the density based on land use designation, rather than looking at particular properties, particular parcels. In some cases, for example, with the community design element, where we are looking at the community places districts, that's looking at the design for those areas because we expect that there could be additional development, and we want to make sure that the character of those community place districts is carefully considered. But in terms of the density, rather than looking at particular sites, it's looking at the designation and the rules so that that is consistent throughout all parcels that have that designation in town. When we get to the housing element update process, that will start looking both at particular properties that could redevelop, or vacant properties that could develop. But it also will be looking at some programs, for example, the accessory dwelling unit program, and how that might be considered. And as we're looking at it right now, one of the timelines that we have been talking about with the consultant for the housing element update could potentially have an initial draft of the housing element going for initial review by HCD in the middle of next year, so that we can get some of that feedback. But we also are working closely with staff at HCD to try and get feedback as we're doing initial analysis and looking at what types of information should be part of that draft element.
Okay, thank you. That's helpful. Councilmember Hudis.
Thank you. And I wanted to suggest, been thinking about it a lot, maybe a little bit more straightforward process that doesn't involve as much back and forth, which is the idea of providing and starting with the RENA allocation. I wonder, there's a slide that I sent in. I wonder if it's possible to put that up, because it has some numbers that I'm going to refer to. And this is where the genesis for this was to ask whether staff would start with analyzing the RENA allocation rather than the projections about what might be built or not be built, but start with that and provide that to the Planning Commission, but also try to maximize affordable housing in the process. So if we were to start with the RENA allocation and allow for revision of the general plan when the next RENA allocation occurs in 8 years, then we would be starting with the 1993 number that we've gotten from the state. And our existing EIR should cover that for at least 16 years. Then add a minimal buffer to that. And if that minimal buffer isn't enough and HCD requires more, then we could come back during the review process, but start with a 15% buffer, which is the range that I've seen on HCD documents. So that would be 299. So that brings us to 2,292. And then from that, and I believe that Councilmember Badami referred to this earlier, we could then look at the existing development capacity that's in the 2020 general plan, which must be supported by ordinance of 1,013 units. Subtract that, look at the likely ADU production and in-process building permits over the next 8 years, which I believe would be 200 plus, ADUs plus 75 in-process permits, so that's 275. Then we're left with a number that we need to plan for by making significant changes. So we would determine the number of new units that must be planned by subtracting the existing capacity and likely ADU from the 2292, and that leaves us with 1,004. That's essentially the same as the Los Gatos Community Alliance provided in their recommendation number 2. With that number, we could take the low density residential changes and the medium density residential changes that are very drastic. We could take them off the table because those 606 units that staff estimated wouldn't be needed at this level. And then we could, with that analysis, that would be part of what would be provided to the Planning Commission as an alternative to the current draft. And it would include what areas the zoning changes would occur. A lot of that was already looked at by GPAC, the densities and the heights to achieve that in order to make those land use changes. At that point, the Planning Commission could look at that alternative versus the draft and essentially vote on something, and then that would get handed off to the Housing Element Advisory Board, and they would then look at the specific sites and the affordable housing categories that would come into play there. And I think that's a way to get to numbers that could be more in line with, I think, what other municipalities are doing in terms of planning for a RENA allocation rather than a double the RENA allocation. I did want to say a few things about affordable housing because I think there's a way to include looking at affordable housing in that, but I wanted to just stop and see whether that made sense to folks or there were questions about that.
Doesn't appear that there's any questions. So if you want to keep going, Councilmember Hudes.
Okay, great. So, I think the challenge with affordable housing is that it's very tough to do, but adopting the 3,904 or 3,854 or 3,425 or 2,939 doesn't really help us get more affordable housing. We don't just get affordable housing by throwing large numbers against the wall and hoping something that will happen. Including excessive numbers in the 4,000 range of all types of housing will limit affordable housing production because developers will cherry pick non-affordable opportunities, build dense luxury housing, and will use up potential sites. We'll actually end up with fewer affordable housing units than if we start by trying to meet the state mandate. And so that's why I think it's important as well for us to try to plan for the 1,167 below market affordable units that are mandated within the 1993 number. And the best opportunity to do that is not by upzoning our single family residences where land prices are high, but by increasing densities for mixed use, high density residential in targeted areas that are maybe within a half mile of existing infrastructure, retail services, and transportation. This will end up yielding smaller units at the same time lessening water and traffic impacts. So, I think that we have additional work to do within the general plan to encourage affordable housing, so that we end up getting more of that as well. And I think that can be part of the process. I also don't think there's the need to analyze, as in the staff report suggests, other intermediate work products of 2,939 and 3,424 and overcomplicate the process. I think it's confusing enough already. And those numbers include these estimates that are in these assumptions that we really don't know whether they are going to hold or not. So I think it would be better to provide an analysis of the RHNA allocation method and work from there to get this thing moving.
Councilmember Risto.
Thank you, Mayor. I appreciate having a variety of options so that there's a good discussion at the Planning Commission. I do know when I was on the Housing Element Advisory Board in 2014, we had a number of places to choose from, a number of locations that we could choose for the housing. And then there was concern about what if some of these sites get developed and then they're not available for the next cycle. And I believe we took those AHAZ areas, the Affordable Housing Overlay Zones, and had those removed if we chose not to use those areas. Can staff correct me on that or verify?
That's correct. We now only have one affordable housing overlay zone. There used to be, I believe, 5. So 4 of them are removed.
So participating in that process, and of course, there's more to the housing element than just working the numbers and the sites. It is talking about accessibility. It's talking about what kinds of units are built. There were a lot of things we covered. But as we were dealing with the numbers and talking about the sites, and it was a process that took over a year with increased understanding, I philosophically feel like the Planning Commission should have a variety of options. The Town Council should have a variety of options coming from the Planning Commission, and that it would serve the Housing Element Advisory Board and our community best for the Housing Element Advisory Board to have choices on where to plan. And then if it looks like we have excess capacity and that's a concern, which it probably would be, then to do a general plan amendment to scale back in the areas that through additional hearings, meetings, public input at the Housing Element Advisory Board, it's deemed the best place to do this. And I would also say, I think we pretty much know that it's incredibly difficult to get affordable housing built, and we don't build it. We can plan for it. We have property in our community that, for example, Ditto's Lane, where many years ago, 32 apartments were proposed and the community was in an uproar over that. We have a number of properties that the town owns that if we wanted to donate and have somebody build at a very high level, we would have a huge amount of pushback from the community. So we know how hard it is to get affordable housing even being built where we could donate the land. And in this case, we're going to be trying to create density and height changes to encourage affordable housing where it's unlikely any of it will be 100% affordable. That's just how market forces work. So I am appreciative, I think the study session is incredibly valuable. I think we're looking at a lot of different points of view, and I think I appreciate having quite a few options go to the Planning Commission, including the one just outlined by Councilmember Hudes. Thank you.
If I could, I'd like to do a quick plug because we are on the subject of affordability. Cal Cities is actually doing a 3-part series in conjunction with Senators Cortese and Becker on affordable housing. Last Friday was the first one, but the financial aspects of affordable housing is so complex. And I know some of the other council members, one in particular from Mountain View, commented that it was helpful. So through the town manager, I'll go ahead and send to you the flyers for the remaining. And I think it might be helpful not only for our colleagues, but also for Planning Commission and our HEB to understand the complexities of that financial aspect. and I'll go ahead and forward that as well. Councilmember Badami?
Thank you. So as a member of GPAC for the last 7 meetings, and reading some of the material that we got prior to me becoming a member, there wasn't much input from the community at all. I mean, I was shocked. So you have 12 members of GPAC, and I would say maybe 30 commenters at best from the public that actually drafted this document, that a recommendation was actually made to approve it as it was, to move forward. The public comments that I've been seeing coming forward, probably would not support that document. So that being said, I am going to echo the comments that we can't make a collective motion here, but I'm individually going to request that staff add a growth option that meets our RENA allocations and provides the zoning that Councilmember Hudes had talked about, and that's targeting mixed use and high density residential land uses, promoting walkability rather than upzoning the whole town. That has the capacity to make some very drastic changes to the character of our town.
And Councilmember Hudes?
Yeah, maybe the Vice Mayor would like to go first.
Sure. I was just going to say what Councilmember Hudes described is what we approved originally from the council, our framework approval that we did a year or more or so ago, which really the growth in our opportunity. We had any upzoning, it was in those areas that could be walkable, and these opportunity zones were aimed at areas that would reduce the effect on our infrastructure. Either they could be closer to schools, closer to commercials, maybe closer to the highway. So if people are going to work, it's very short distance to get on the highway. I think that he described what we plan. So it's not really in our packet tonight, but I assume it will come back. It'll go to the HEB and to the Planning Commission and so forth. Those pieces in that way. And if we wanted to dial that number back, then it could be removing some of the opportunity zones, which I had sort of mentioned as the nickel through the process earlier. But I do like what Councilmember Risto said is, let's allow some more options to the housing element team. Councilmember Hudes mentioned it's really hard to get affordable housing. I think that's what the job of the HEB is to try to figure out how do we get affordable housing, and we want to leave them as many tools as we can to do that. But what I'm hearing is, even if the general plan takes some of those tools off the table, they can still think about them and hopefully will if they find that to be a better solution. The growth across the town idea that was added sometime after we approved a framework, it seems to me that needs to just be redirected into the SB9 discussion and figure out what SB9 requires of us, and then do that. I still think, sustainably, if we're going to increase density, we need to do it in places where we're going to be light on our infrastructure. And I'm not sure we're quite to that discussion yet. We're at a high level. This is what we want to do. So that's and I guess the one other piece that was added was residential over office, which was added after our original framework. That may be a good idea. It does raise the number up quite a bit. Again, I kind of like to leave it as a tool for the housing, for the HEB, but maybe later, if they don't need it, take it off the table, as I was talking about with our process. Thank you. My comment.
Thank you, Vice Mayor. Councilmember Hudes.
Thanks. Lots of thoughts here, and having worked on the Housing Element Advisory Board with Councilmember Risto. I do remember a lot of that process, and I think finally, when we finally voted on it, I got a little bit of an inkling what it was all about. It took that long to get my arms around all of it. But I do think that fundamentally the council has a responsibility on certain aspects of this that is to look at anything that might involve town-wide upzoning. Basically going as the current draft describes, currently going from a 0 to 5 to a 112. That's basically 2.4 units where 1 unit exists now. And the concern there is that SB 9 would layer on top of that. Because if we were to make those zoning changes, as far as I understand, those smaller lots would still be adequate for many aspects of SB 9. So, I think it's important that we take the general plan to a certain point, and provide options to the Planning Commission to work through it. Absolutely. But then, vote on what we think the fundamentals of the general plan should be, and then let the Housing Element Advisory Board work to solve the issue about which sites specifically, which sites would accommodate how many units of what income level, what kind of setbacks and building heights would occur on those sites. Those are the kinds of things that we wrestled with the last time around. And I think that we ended up with a good result from that process. So anyway, I appreciate all the comments, and then I think that it would be
Your hand raised.
I just wanted to make you aware of the time. It is 6:23. If you wanted to allow for public comment, we do have a hard stop time.
Yes, we do. Thank you for that reminder. And so council members, I want to open it up for public comment. And so are there any further comments? Okay, so if I could just, by raise of hands, I see 42 attendees. Obviously, I'm going to try and accommodate as many speakers as possible. That may not allow for all 3 minutes. So if I can, for those who would like to speak, if you could raise your hand so I could just get a sense of how many, and then let's split the time remaining to give everyone that opportunity.
And just a friendly reminder that public comments need to be focused on the topic at hand. There will be a separate option for verbal communications on any topic at the 7 p.m. session. But as a study session, we need the verbal comments to focus on the general plan. Thank you.
Thank you for that. So at this time, I see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I see 6 hands raised. And so that'll give us 18 minutes, and that'll give us that'll carry us. So I'm going to go ahead and allow these 3 to speak for 3 minutes each. And again, you don't have to, but at least you'll have that time. So our first speaker, Rob Moore.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for a very productive conversation. This has been really informative, and I appreciate everyone's comments tonight. So I am here to talk about the draft 2040 general plan, which I think, while imperfect, is a strong guiding document that will help move our community in the right direction. I'm here tonight to speak in support of it in its current form, but I support Councilmember Risto and other suggestions of having a variety of options to go before the Planning Commission and Town Council. I want to begin by saying that no matter how we all feel about more housing in Los Gatos, we have no choice but to build. The state is coming heavy-handedly into our community and dictating how we build housing. Laws like SB 9 were implemented because communities like ours refuse to build housing. And I think that this will continue to happen as long as we attempt to resist development in our town. Right now, we have the opportunity to build housing that fits the character of Los Gatos and housing that is well planned out. If we drag our feet, the state will build housing in its cookie cutter way. And I think we can all agree this is much less desirable for our town. I hope that we can talk about not whether or not we build more housing or if we build more dense housing, but how we can build this housing and how it looks and feels and how we make it affordable. The general plan has a few really important elements that I just want to touch on real briefly. I think perhaps the most important that we're talking about right now is the land use element. And I think it does three really key things. It allows for a substantial number of affordable units to be built, which I think is something we all think is really important. And I think it's important because to do this through both creating designated capital A low income affordable housing, but also encouraging the development of more dense, naturally affordable missing middle housing. I also think the creative approach it takes to where housing should be built is really important. I think community place districts are a really innovative part of this plan. And last, I think that the land use element helps make our town more walkable and improves our transportation infrastructure, which is really important. Real briefly, there are other elements of the general plan that I think are quite important that I think we should all remember when we're talking about approving this element, that we can get done not just housing, but also the racial, social, environmental justice element, which pushes for more DEI in our town and also discusses affordability. There's the mobility element, which will reduce vehicle miles traveled and encourage a more connected, more accessible town, and also the environmental and sustainability element, which takes important steps for Los Gatos to do its part in addressing climate change and encouraging plant-based eating. Thank you all for your time. Have a great council meeting.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Leone.
I had a question, Mayor.
Yes, go ahead.
Councilmember. Yeah, for Mr. Moore, are you speaking for yourself or are you representing the Housing Element Advisory Board?
Yeah, no, I apologize for not clarifying that. Totally just speaking as an individual.
Thank you.
Thank you. Our next speaker, Leone.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mariko. And thank you. First, I want to say thank you all who are here tonight and who work so hard for the town. And I just appreciate you all. And I listen to this and it's fantastic that you're doing this. Anyway, so I'm hopeful. I don't know if anyone can give me any feedback or not. I'm hopeful, but hopeful in the housing element, did I hear that it's flexible at this point for the 2040 general plan and that it could be, the requirement could be anywhere from 1,900 to 3,800 units? And is it flexible, the amount of units? I'm hearing that there's flexibility. Is that true?
And so Leone, at this time, we're just taking comments. We'll be able to answer all those questions at the end.
Okay, dear. Well, anyway, I hope it's flexible because personally, I think that again, I've said this before, with the traffic that funnels through our town, it's not going to go away. It's there. It's like the elephant in the room. We all know about it. And I think that there should be a waiver if there was extenuating, I'm not using the right word, an extreme amount of housing that the state requires through the SB program. I think that this town can have it waived. I think it can be pleaded and you have a good case, okay? So, but if it's a flexible amount of housing that we have to do, then I think it's possible. But again, I don't think there's any way with the way the traffic funnels and the things that I hear and the people that live downtown experience, it's, and I see it already with the North 40. And of course, if it's a flexible amount, again, I'm not so concerned about it anymore. For future generations, obviously, I'm not going to be here forever, but for future generations, I'm very concerned about the water and all the environmental aspects of adding multiple units to a town that's already impacted with gridlock, 3 or 4 months out of the year. So, but I love what you're doing and I hope it is flexible and I thank you all. And particularly, I haven't heard Matthew Hudis till tonight and I appreciate everything you said too. Take care.
Thank you. Our next speaker is David Weisman.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Thank you. I think that Los Gatos doesn't have a shortage of newly built above market housing. We have a shortage of below market housing, having just met 13% of our fourth RENA cycle requirements and 30% of our fifth RENA cycle with 1 year remaining. Yet it seems that not a week goes by that I read about another Bay Area town or city that through innovative partnership and financial assistance from Measure A funds and tax-exempt bonds, among other options, that the cities of Santa Clara, Fremont, Belmont, Mountain View, Palo Alto, Burlingame, etc., are building new below-market housing projects. It simply doesn't pay for a developer to build below-market housing without outside help. So I suggest that we need to pair up with one or more of our local nonprofit housing groups and work together. We also shouldn't be voluntarily doubling our next RENA cycle numbers, since we have no idea what tomorrow brings from Sacramento, much less in 20 years. And after we pass our new housing element, I appreciate hearing Mr. Paulson supporting an automatic every 5-year review of our progress. Anything longer than 5 years is too long to respond to the latest from Sacramento. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Jack Estill.
Thank you. I'd like to thank you all for a very informative evening. This has been very helpful, and I appreciate the viewpoints that were presented. I think the one thing that surprised me a little bit is that I've heard very little about the fiscal impact of these proposals. And so I'm hopeful that when we finally come up with some alternatives, that there's a fiscal element to it. I was encouraged to hear that you were taking a more targeted approach to providing this housing, particularly trying to hit those more dense areas, because that would certainly lessen the impact on our infrastructure. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Lindley Hogan.
Good evening, and can you hear me? Yeah, I think so. Thank you. My concern is, as I think many people's is, and I think Mr. Hudy's expressed that too, and that is, if I understood correctly, but is the housing density and transforming Los Gatos into a city that is just like every other place around here. And I'm also concerned about the whole plant-based diet thing. That seems like government is overreaching, maybe would be the word. And I'm not sure why that would be a part of any government plan for the people. So I'm curious to know more about that. And I think that's about it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Our next speaker, we've gone through the 6. We have a little bit more time, so I will see 2 more, Ali Miano and then Barbara Dodson for 3 minutes each.
Thank you for taking my comments and for the work that you're doing. I just wanted to encourage the council to, yes, as other speakers have said, try to incorporate affordable housing in your plan as much as you can. We know that affordable housing actually helps decrease traffic, which is a concern that a previous speaker made. And I very much appreciate Mr. Weiss's comments as well regarding the need for affordable housing, that other local municipalities are doing that. I think it also helps with the character of our neighborhoods. And past meetings, I have, noted that I see many of the wonderful bungalows, the historic bungalows in town being built out, and, these, if you will, McMansions taking their place. And I wonder about the resources that those larger and not very dense buildings are going to use up, like extra air conditioning and other, gobbling up resources that go to a few people living in a very large home, versus spreading the wealth, if you will, and allowing more people to occupy this wonderful little town. So I would really appreciate it if you would continue in that vein and take into account the many residents that do appreciate efforts toward affordable housing. Councilwoman Risto, you mentioned, oh gosh, I'm forgetting the name of the street now, near College Avenue, and that effort. And I was one of the people who went, door knocking, and I was actually surprised that many people actually in the neighborhood did support that effort, but somehow our voices were drowned out. So I am hoping that this time out, our voices will not be drowned out, and that, yes, all will be able to be welcome here, and that at least some low market housing, hopefully much increased from where it is now, will be the focus of the general plan going forward. Thanks so much.
Thank you. And as we are having speakers, I'm seeing more hands raised. Just a reminder, we do have a hard stop at 6:45, and I'll keep going until we reach that. Our next speaker is Barbara Dodson.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Okay. I'd like to thank you also for having this meeting, which has been really informative. I just have a few comments that have probably been already given, but here we go. I think it will be a challenge to create the roughly 2,000 homes called for by RENA. And I think we should under no circumstances create the opportunity through the general plan for double that number of homes to almost 4,000. This projection should be removed from the general plan so that nobody gets the idea that we actually are welcoming that amount of development. On another note, please keep in mind that most of us want to retain the small town feeling of Los Gatos. I strongly oppose increasing housing density in areas where single family homes have for decades set the tone for what life is like here. I oppose the upzoning called for in the general plan. We need affordable housing, but it should be planned for wisely, not by allowing random placements of 4 units where one was previously allowed. Smack in the middle of areas previously zoned and already built up with single homes only. Finally, in the North 40, we had the chance to create affordable housing and we blew it. Let's not do that again. I would like the general plan to codify the idea that developers cannot build more luxury housing until we have created substantial amounts of affordable housing. Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker, just the name is Zoom user.
Oh, hey, hello. Sorry, I didn't realize that my name didn't show. My name is Lulu Sterling. Thank you for hearing my comment. This is my 3rd or 4th town council meeting that I attended in regard of the 2040 plan. So, so today I'm not going to repeat my concerns about this plan because I think my fellow residents had said enough. What I want to know is, I think if everybody's paying attention, every single meeting, there's more than at least 90% of residents are opposing the current draft of general plan. So in response to that, what have been done so far? This thing has been going on since late summer. I think all the residents wants to see what changes has been made, what is in discussion in response to our comments. And in relation to that, I also want to suggest some changes to the format of this council meeting. I think just hearing comment and say, we'll collect the comment and it will be provided in staff reports and that kind of thing, that does not give enough transparency to local residents. We really need a forum where the council members can, or the town manager or whoever that's participating in this general plan can have a face-to-face real-time conversation. When local residents have a question, we want answers, right? So I think some format change will be very beneficial. I think the lack of understanding of what the residents want and what is represented in a few places. For example, in one of the older past meetings, when the topic of why the RENA number was doubled and it did not come back to the council for discussion. And I remember as our town manager, I quote, said it was my personal discretion. And at some point, I also remember a council member making comments saying, we were never afraid of that original number. We were ready for that. So who's the we? What kind of communication you had with the local residents for you to make that kind of conclusion, right? So I think that just shows where there's a disconnect between what's being put on the table and what the local residents want. So I would strongly encourage you guys consider some kind of different format of communication with the residents. Thank you.
Thank you. And before I call our next speaker, I do want to just clarify that the numbers here are not personal preferences. And I know that there's this rumor out there that this is the manager's personal preference. I want to just assure everyone this is done by committee and not by any individual preference. And so our next speaker, and I think that'll probably be our last one given our time constraint, is Ken Aaron.
Hi, can you hear me? Just shake your heads. Thank you. Good evening, town council members, mayor. My name is Ken Arendt. I've been here a long time, and I'd like to express some very strong concerns that I've had, and maybe I'm incorrect about some of the things about how this came about, but I do remember council meetings earlier that I attended in which Councilmember Hudes asked questions like, where did these numbers come from the town manager and her staff without having approached the town council first? It seems to be a violation of the town ordinances in that the town council is responsible for policy, not the town manager. That's number one. Number two, I have to congratulate Councilmember Hudes on his comments and his very simple slide to take this complex situation and bring it down to some reality, because we have a situation in which I think there are several critical factors that are not addressed in all of our review and comments and considerations of whatever we do, fiscal, operational, and infrastructure. We have issues today that we're dealing with. When I see a slide that says, okay, we're going to double or potentially double our population over the next few years, we can't deal with what we have today. And I don't see any planning or thought process that goes towards that. I really have a problem with that. And I'd like to, see some thought going into how that occurs and how we go forward from there. And I just thank you all for doing this. It's a very difficult situation. I know, having talked to a lot of my friends and relatives and people who live in Los Gatos here over the years, a lot of people are not very happy with the way this is going right now. So please consider my comments along those lines, and let's hope that we can come out of this a lot better situation than we are now. Thank you.
Thank you. And as I mentioned prior, unfortunately, I will close public comments. We do have a hard stop at 6:45, and I'd like to now close public testimony, bring it back to council, and I just want to give staff an opportunity to now walk those in attendance through the process. And I want to acknowledge for those that are watching, yes, at times these processes are sometimes overly bureaucratic and that there are no immediate answers, but in many ways, that's what makes this a transparent process, in that no one discretionary opinion follows and dictates the process. It is done by committee, it is done by commission, and then ultimately by council. But I would like, whether it be our attorney or our town staff, to walk our community through this process. There are many more opportunities to weigh in. And if you could just clarify what that process is now, so that people are well aware of the following steps and the different opportunities to weigh in.
Thank you, Mayor. And thank you, Arn, for sharing this. These are the next steps in the process. I'd actually like to start by sharing with the community, everybody who's attending today, that the process did actually start 4 years ago with a check-in with town council, then hiring a consultant, creating the general plan update advisory committee, having 35 meetings with them, and throughout the process, checking back in with town council and planning commission on different elements, including the vision, the guiding principles, the land use alternative, preferred land use alternative framework, and then coming back also for discussions with the initial draft implementation of that framework in the form of the land use element. And then further conversations since then. There have also been many public outreach meetings and other outreach techniques that have been used through the process. But starting today and moving forward, the process includes an opportunity tomorrow night. If anyone has verbal comments on the revised draft EIR, any portion of the environmental impact report, you can comment on that at the Planning Commission meeting tomorrow. The agenda is available online. We also welcome written comments, and those can be submitted on the draft EIR through Friday, January 7th at 5 p.m. We also continue through this entire time and up until a final town council meeting to welcome any public comments on the draft general plan itself, not just the EIR. Once a final EIR in response to comments have been prepared, we will then bring that along with the draft general plan and all public comments that have been received on the draft general plan to Planning Commission for their review. We hope to be able to do that in February, but it depends on the time that it takes to prepare that final EIR. And so all comments will be included there and will be part of the discussion by Planning Commission. Then their recommendation will be taken and shared with planning and with town council for consideration of the draft 2040 general plan and final EIR.
Thank you, Ms. Harmer. And at this time, I don't see any other hands raised, and so I will adjourn today's meeting, today's study session. Thank everyone that has been in attendance. Thank the council members, and see everyone back here at 7 o'clock. Thank you.